That is a great question. I actually had not thought about the fact that it was the first Sunday of Black History Month. So thanks for throwing me a curveball. But I have an answer for you.
Jesus' greatest hits. That's what we've got this coming Sunday, the first Sunday in February. Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7. We're going all over the place. And this is going to be a great sermon, and this particular moment is going to be a great conversation. Reverend Thorne, Jesus' greatest hits is what I believe your sermon title is currently running with. Good, love it. And you'll see on screen a new face to this show, the Reverend Robert Lee, who's a speaker, author, all sorts of good, holy trouble in the world. Rob, glad to have you joining us for the Word Made Fresh. And we're going to dive in and talk about the Bible because I'm pretty sure the three of us are pretty solid Bible geeks. So, Rob, good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, y'all. It's such an honor to be here on this podcast that I myself listen to make sure that I am staying in track with what the Riverside Church is saying. So it's grateful. I'm grateful to be here.
Well, that's exactly the hope. You know, we want to give a glimpse at what's coming up at Riverside's pulpit, but also just share ideas that others can borrow and lean on for their own purposes as well. So, Reverend Thorne, you're back in the pulpit, and there's, I think, a lot of things going, and we're going to just talk about all these intersections. But first, maybe just give us where are you leaning into with this portion of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' greatest hits? And then eventually we're going to move to the question, how do you hold the first Sunday of Black History Month with all of this goodness as well? So I'll let you kind of decide how you want to navigate that.
That is a great question. I actually had not thought about the fact that it was the first Sunday of Black History Month. So thanks for throwing me a curveball. But I have an answer for you, because where I'm going, these greatest hits, this particular portion of the Sermon on the Mount, which is the ending, the wrap up, sort of, is talking about the portion that kind of gives us our theme for our Lenten journey. So it's about following, it's about doing. So our Lenten theme is follow the leader, follow this leader, and what he does. And it's out of these greatest hits of Jesus that we get this notion that faith is doing, that faith is following, that it's not enough to hear, we have to obey and do. And that's where I'm going. And I think there's a really beautiful bridge from there to the first Sunday in Black History Month, because as we all know, there's still so much work left to do to eradicate white supremacy, to make a world on earth as there is in heaven, to live out the dream of Dr. King. However you want to language that, there's still a lot of doing that needs to happen.
I love that. You know, we've talked in the past with our Riverside clergy. It's one thing to have a dream, and a dream is good, but you got to also do. If it just is living in your head, it's got to come out of our hands and our feet and come to life in the world. And this section very much gives us that. We got a bit on judging others, ask, search, knock. The whole ask it shall be given to you. The golden rule. I have some thoughts and questions on that. Narrow gate. Beware of false prophets. This Jesus is just, this is his I have a dream speech moment. He's just pulling out all the stops and giving us the grand finale.
And don't forget the house that is built on the rock and the sand, which I think is really the sort of summary of all that has come before. It's how you're building this life that you're living. How are you engaging your faith for good in the world? And it's something that we do brick by brick, day by day, moment by moment. And so there's a way in which that metaphor at the end becomes like the guiding metaphor for life.
Yeah. Rob, Reverend Lee, I'd love to hear any input from your end as you think about this particular portion of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is really, pulling out the stops here, but then also as we approach a Sunday with so many options in the text and the first Sunday of Black History Month, and you share a complexion like I do, so that might bring another layer to that response.
My dogs are barking too, so I'm sorry. Which is in the text. It works. It's in the text that dogs bark, and that we can't do that with the dogs. So sorry about that. But I will say that it's interesting. One of the things I like to do, Pastor Thorne and Jim, is that I like to go and sometimes look at what the evangelicals are saying about this text. something I would never do, something I would never, really say. But I would kind of want to know where they are with this, so I can know where I need to be in either opposition or in agreement. And what's interesting is that they have trouble squaring the "judge not" text with the rest of their theology. I listened to like 3 sermons that probably I can't get that time back. But in that time, I heard them say, gosh, what he meant was you have to judge this way. What he meant is you have to judge that way. They are doing the mental gymnastics to get out of taking that text seriously. So I actually think this is an interesting point for progressives to say, gosh, why aren't we taking Jesus for Jesus' word here when he says, judge not, lest ye be judged? And in connection with Black History Month, one of the more interesting stories I have about this is I was interviewed after the Charleston Emanuel 9 shooting. And I was asked by the editor of Huffington Post if I would forgive Dylan Roof, the person who perpetrated such evil against those 9 Black worshipers. And I said, no, that ain't me. And then you see time after time the forgiveness being offered by the Black community. I don't think that that's something that we should celebrate, but it is something that we should take our lead to stay in our lane. And I learned that the hard way that time, that it's important for me as a white person in Black History Month to stay in my lane and remember that sometimes it's far more complex than we're willing to admit.
Yeah, the nature of racial diversity, specifically us white folk with Black History Month, it's not uncommon. Well, I'm sure we're going to see it all February. White people tweeting, "Where's the White History Month?" To which we obviously say, "You mean the other 11?" So it definitely invites us all into an intentional reflection and ways in which we engage these seasons and these texts, and what lane are we in, as you've said, Reverend Thorne, what leader are we following, and where are we headed as we follow in those directions?
Yeah, and I want to just add to that, Jim. I want to encourage my European descendant siblings to lean into the discomfort that comes perhaps with preaching Black History Month, to not necessarily make this or any other cultural history month the month that you invite your African American, Asian, Pacific Islander friends to come and preach. We are preachers, as you suggested, the other 11 months of the year, and would love to visit you outside of February. I think there is something powerful about the European descended folk wrestling with Black History Month in their context, because I think there's something powerful for your people seeing you address it. I have often been told that there's certain folk I can't invite into the pulpit on certain days, but it's okay for me to preach outside of my cultural context. I think we all need to be wrestling and struggling with what it means to bring these contexts into the space and wrestle with them as an African American woman, as a European descended man, and so on and so forth. Because we won't always be able to invite the guest preacher. We may not have the budget. The folk that we need or want in our pulpit may not live like in our neighborhood. So then what do? Skip it? No, I think we bring those stories into the room and wrestle with them and attempt to be faithful the way God has called us to be faithful.
That is a good little note to take for all of these months that have certain focuses and emphases. And that's not just the token invitation month. It's a reminder to integrate that all year long.
Yeah, say that.
So I want to take a moment, because again, this is Jesus' greatest hits. There's so many little like boop, 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 boop. This is like if Jesus was on Twitter, this is him just firing off tweets kind of a thing. But the golden rule, it's 7 verse 12. It's just a single verse. You could tweet this thing. In everything, do to others as you would have them do to you. For this is the law and the prophets. So I'm always enamored by this, not just because of what it says and it's a good idea, but Jesus didn't make that one up. If anything, he's just, leaning into his Confucianism roots there, because as far as I can see, one of the oldest credits of that was Confucius in the 5th century BCE. Although Confucius, I have it written down here, his was inversed. He said, "What you do not want done to yourself, do not do unto others." So, but it's generally the same principle. But I'm just always blown away thinking, when we read the Bible, we're like, oh, Jesus is just inventing all of this out of nowhere. And I'm always reminded with even a single little verse like that one here, verse 12, Jesus is coming from a particular context. He's coming in part of history, and he's leaning into the stream that he's just inevitably being, floating along in. And so it reminds me, Jesus is a person. He actually happened in a particular point in time, and history was happening. And then we need to learn that broader history. It's where if all you do is read the words on the page, I mean, that's a good place to start, but don't stop there. You got to recognize this is a snapshot of so much more. And that one little moment of Jesus didn't invent the golden rule? What? Jesus, other faith traditions said it first? What? So
Yeah.
I don't always know what to do with that, but I just really appreciate that.
Yeah, well, I think one thing Matthew's gospel reminds us is that Jesus was a good Jewish boy. There's not a lot that he invented. There's a lot that comes out of his tradition. And as we heard last night in that clip we played at Space for Grace Notes, he brings radical newness to teachings and laws that existed. I think Matthew, more than any other gospel, is making that link between Jesus and Moses, and he's doing something new with it. I love that the speaker last night said that Jesus was a mutation, right? There's something not quite right with Jesus, she said, that he takes this stuff that is traditional Jewish law, traditional Jewish belief, and just flips it, like really turns it upside down in a way that you're like, that's not what I heard in the synagogue. And I love that. And then that invitation for us to do the same.
Yeah.
And I think the richness of our tradition is that we don't own it. It's not ours. We can share it, but it does not belong to us. And that is important to remember in any experience that we have, whether we're on the street or whether we're in a pulpit. It's not ours. It's not ours. It is ours to behold and ours to hold out to others. But to suggest that we have any ownership or that even Jesus had some ownership in some of these lines, I don't think that's fair to Jesus. Because Jesus reminds us that walking together is kind of the point of this, right? We're walking, to borrow from Ram Dass, I love that line, we're all just walking each other home. And Jesus walks alongside us.
Amen.
I'm hearing echoes of last week's conversation. It's not my Father, it's our Father.
Our Father.
I've heard someone say once, there's no such thing as a singular Christian. It has to be plural. It's implicit that there will be community. You are connected to others in this thing. And like you're saying, Rob, we don't, it's not mine. I don't own it. I don't get to, put it in a box and say, I have it. No, this, and even like we see here in this little moment in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is drawing from things outside of even his bounds, or it shows the way in which things from other faith traditions just weave their way into all of our waters, and we don't always even realize how connected we actually are.
Also, Jim, I think it gives us a lot of comfort that these greatest hits aren't just for us alone to achieve. So the building of the house, the golden rule, the treating of the neighbor in the ways that we treat ourselves, we do that only because we've got a community supporting us. We've got grandmamas and aunties and uncles and cousins and church mothers reminding us of who we are and what we're intended to do. So to your point about not being a Christian alone, we do these things only and because we've got a community and, of course, the supernatural movement of the Holy Spirit.
So one last question for you both. This particular pericope, like we've mentioned a lot, covers a lot. There's a lot of different, entry points. So let's just turn this into a little homiletics class. How do you decide? How do you choose which piece to use? Or do you do the typical first-year seminary student mistake and try to preach everything in one single sermon? And maybe you're just, master at it and you can pull that off. That's great. But how do you even kind of discern, pick? What's your process for kind of pulling your radar to see where it's leading you into a multifaceted text like this one?
Rob, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think when I was, in seminary, I wanted to try and be that preacher that could do it, be everything for everybody. And that wasn't me. I'm not that preacher. And I know that about myself now, and I'm grateful to have learned that over trial and error over years after seminary and in pulpits and learning that. But I think what's important is that we call it the spirit, call it your gut, call it there's something in you that is rising to the top when you first read the text. I think sometimes reading the text the first time when you know you have to preach it is sometimes the most important, because in your mind there's going to be something that flags it for you, or a story that comes to the top, or an idea that bubbles up, and that in and of itself is worth listening to. Now, does it always end up that way? No, I'm a Saturday night preacher sometimes, and I'm rewriting my sermon. But that said, that first thought, that first bubble up, that first coming to the surface is really important when choosing a rich text like this, because it's rich. It's like a rich piece of chocolate. You can't, to experience in one setting would be very hard, and maybe not the most healthy thing to do. So you do it the best you can with the materials in front of you.
Yeah, it's a great word. And you're so right. I often land somewhere. I have this conversation with Jim. I land somewhere else. I start writing. I land somewhere else. And then, as you said, Saturday night, it's like, yeah, it's all terrible. I'm redoing the whole thing. And you step into the pulpit, and I'm sure Jim watches the sermon on Sunday, and he's like, that is not what we talked about. But like I said, the spirit is moving, and you're also engaging the stories of the people you're in community with. You have these conversations, your kid does something, you read something in the paper, and everything just goes sideways and comes out the way it needs to come out. It really, again, that notion of community, that I don't know that we write these sermons by ourselves. We write them with folks in mind, and moved around by what's happening in our world and in our own lives, and certainly in the lives of the people we serve.
It is definitely an ever-evolving, it's a mutating process, you could say, sermon writing is, to bring that word back into it. And I love all of that, paying attention to your own kind of gut and instincts and what direction that sends you in. But then obviously continue reading it, continue researching it, but don't suppress those initial impulses, but then continue to do the faithful work, even up until those final moments. I like to think when I step into a pulpit, there's got to be at least one moment when everyone is a little bit surprised, including the preacher. Like, oh, I didn't know that was going to happen. If I'm and that's just my approach to life. I think if I'm that white knuckle gripped, am I giving room for this, wind of God to blow through these, old sails and take them someplace? So I love all of that. And like for me, this golden rule thing, I'm drawn to that. We have a children's book, Confucianism for Babies, and it has Confucius saying that line. I'm like, wait a minute, this is and I was, of course it is, and went back and had. So I just, all the influences that we bring to our preaching life. You never know what this stew is going to be, but it seems by Sunday morning it's plated and served and typically well received, and it nourishes us in so many necessary ways. I just had stew for lunch, so I got that metaphor running through me. Oh, all right. Well, another week, another episode of The Word Made Fresh. Preachers, Bible study leaders, Bible geeks, let us know your thoughts in a comment on Jesus' greatest hits. There's a whole lot going on here in Matthew chapter 7. We'd love to hear your input, share your ideas. How do you decide which aspect to take when you're leading and creating something? And Rob, thanks so much for hanging out. Adrienne, always great to see you. And we'll all keep doing this work and doing it again and again and again. We'll talk with you all on the next one.